Welcome to this TIPS Development Dialogue that's looking at the important issue of master plans. My name's Saul Levine, I'm Executive Director of TIPS, and we've got a panel today comprising Dr. Niva Makgetla, Dr. Lung, there's too many doctors in this room, Lunga Msengana, and Rudy Dix. Unfortunately, Zukiso, who is supposed to join us from the dtic, has had to go into an urgent meeting with the minister, who's just arrived in office, as we know, and would need to get briefings from the department. So unfortunately, she isn't able to join us for this session. It would have been really important to hear their insights, but we thought, let's proceed. These things are unavoidable. So just a few things from my side. TIPS has been working on the master plans. We've done an evaluation of the master plans, but even prior to that, we played an active role in supporting the development or the research that went into the development of several master plans. We've also worked with partners to develop some of the master plans and done some thinking about how these master plans should be structured. So we have had several papers out on that are on our website. We've also looked at some of the cross-cutting issues that were emerging from the master plans, and we put together a short think piece on that on our website as well. And we've got quite a lot of thinking that's happened, and we thought it'd be useful to have a public session to engage on some of the content around where should we be going with this master plan. So it's not linked to any one specific master plan. It's around this master plan project. How do we understand it? What are we trying to achieve, and where are we going with it? Particularly at this point in time where we have a new administration who are thinking about where do we go with the policy direction around industrial policy. And for the last few years, master plans have formed a very important part of how the DTIC in particular, but not only the DTIC, including the presidency, has been thinking around industrial policy. So we've got a number of people online, we've got a number of people in the room, and as I often say when I'm chairing these development dialogues, we don't only have the experts on the panel, we also have experts in the room and online. Just a note that Rudy Dix from the presidency is online and will be arriving in person. He had an urgent meeting, as happens as well, but is still going to be joining us in the next few minutes in person, and will be the discussant after Lunga and Niva have presented. So we've got a great discussion going, and then we're going to open it up and allow for people to share their experiences on the master plans, good and bad. And we in a challenging context with a number of headwinds that are facing the economy, and the master plans were put forward as part of the way forward. So let's hear from our experts and see what's happening, and also we're looking forward to a lot of engagement from the audience on that. Thanks. And I think online people, Nondu has shared a link to the TIPS website. Also to note that all the presentations and the video of this seminar will also be available on the website for those who want to share it or review it later. I can just talk a bit more about what TIPS has been doing in thinking about the master plan process. And Lunga, who heads up our master plan project management unit, will talk more to some of the lessons. But we've set up a project management unit that's been supporting the implementation of agreed master plans. So in addition to the research that TIPS has done over the last couple of years, and also in partnership with others, we have the master plan project management unit that has been, as a project manager and sometimes a support person, dedicated to helping with the implementation of the master plan. So part of Lunga's insights will be on how things have evolved and some of the lessons that we've learned along the way in a very difficult climate. I think we've started some of these master plans during COVID, and some slightly before them. So it's been a very difficult period, and trying to set up a project management unit to implement master plans during that has also come with its own challenges. And I think the experiences that we can talk to will help to shape the next phase that we're going into with a renewed focus or different focus on master plans. Let me ask Neva then to come up and present.
Hi, thank you. And just want to say, so I've also just got his doctorate, so it's Dr. Levine. Okay, so where this comes from is basically we were asked to do an evaluation because it's been 5 years since master plans were introduced, which was in 2019. And the aim is to help identify new opportunities and areas for improvement. So just to be clear, the aim was never to say, do they work or not in some abstract sense. The aim was to say, we need this kind of meso-level strategy. That's what industrial policy is about. How can we ensure they work better? And just to be clear, also, we said we would review the overall master plans project. So obviously, that does mean you have to look at the individual master plans as implementing that project. But it's not about looking in detail at the individual master plans, although we did do some case studies, which we're going to publish all of this separately. Okay, so part of the problem is there is not a single, or was not a single published policy document on the master plan strategy and what it was trying to achieve. There were various kinds of internal presentations and things, presentations to Parliament as well, on the reimagined industrial strategy, which was the framework that introduced the idea that we should be doing master plans, essentially as building on IPAP, but changing it quite substantially. One of the issues for the evaluation is you always want to evaluate something against its ultimate objectives. Because there wasn't a published document, there is actually no clear statement of the objectives of the master plans. So we said we would evaluate it against the overall DTIC vision, which is basically about a globally competitive economy, but that is also characterized by economic transformation and provides more opportunities for citizens. So in other words, it's about both growth and inclusion, not one or the other. Next slide. Okay, so just to be clear about why we're saying inclusion is important and also what it means to industrialize in the South African context, just two things to say. If you look at our dependence on mining, this is the share of, the first graph is the share of exports, share of particular products in our exports of goods, because exports of services are of course hard to find. What you can see is we're unusually dependent on mining exports compared to other upper middle income countries. But also if you look at the left-hand side, we have very weak labor intensive industries. And of course, what made industrial policy popular in other countries that have succeeded is that it generated employment on a large scale because it started with relatively labor-intensive industries and only then moved into capital-intensive ones. So, even today, we still rely very heavily on mining because coal is also under fuel. And to some extent, food exports have been growing, but those basic labor-intensive industries haven't grown. So even where we have achieved more advanced manufacturing, we haven't really created that many jobs. And also we continue to have in that context extremely high joblessness. So the chart on the right is the share of working age people with employment. Since 1994, we've been about 20% behind the norm. So employment has grown with the population and the economy, but we have not actually made that qualitative shift to catch up on the deficit that was left by apartheid. And honestly, the biggest gap is still in self-employment because of the way apartheid destroyed small-scale African production, both rural and urban. So that, I've been thinking about it. This is like saying if your leg is amputated, you can't necessarily grow back your leg. So that doesn't mean the only solution is small business, but it does suggest that where we have a gap relative to other countries is in terms of small business, primarily. Okay, so the way we understood the master plan project was that it had 5 sort of key innovations. Firstly, that there should be well-defined aims for industrial policy, which would guide the master plans. So the documentation says we need to really say, what are we trying to achieve with our industrial policy before we go into the master plans? The second thing was that there should be a focus on a few industries that, taken as a group, if we scale up support to them, they would have the capacity to actually bring about significant structural change in the economy. Once you've selected the industries, there should be close collaboration with the stakeholders, especially essentially established business and organized labor. And in many ways, the argument was that setting up those platforms and having that ongoing engagement was more important than what goes into the actual published document. So the argument was it should be a living process where, as you encounter obstacles, you try and deal with them, rather than just having a fixed plan that can't change. But obviously that kind of thing only works if you're clear about where you're trying to go. You know what I mean? It's that Deng Xiaoping thing about if you cross the river, you have to feel for the stones. But if you don't know you're trying to get across the river, you know, you can't just keep detouring up and downstream and getting lost and very wet. It should be an evidence-based approach, so you'd have ongoing evaluation and learning. So it shouldn't just be an issue of power between stakeholders, but we should rather resolve areas where we disagree by getting the evidence out there. And on that basis, there should be a scaling up of the resources and including alignment across the state, so the entire state capacity would support these things, so that we genuinely have an impact on the economy rather than faffing around the edges. And the model for this was the way the Auto Master Plan was perceived as a very major intervention that has actually transformed the auto industry in South Africa. And it was basically saying, can we do the same kind of thing for other key industries? Next slide. I'm not going to go through the theory of change. We'll send it around. You can read it. Theories of change are very useful when you're thinking about stuff, but often not so useful to hear. Yeah? Okay, so in terms of how it was actually implemented, we never really did get to say, what are our priorities for industrial policy? Yeah? And I think if you read government documents, you'll see it's often quite unclear. Are we prioritizing inclusion? Are we prioritizing industrialization? Have we actually thought about how those two things relate and how we get a decent balance? Because really, in practice, what it means is how much resource do we put into trying to support and upgrade established business? And how much effort do we put into trying, and resources do we put into trying to open up new opportunities by setting up new kinds of production clusters, new products that can actually generate new opportunities? In 2023, the presidency published a master plan guide. I have to say that one doesn't really help with this because they recommend methods that are used to define what businesses need to grow better or to overcome declines. That is, Pestle and Porter's 5 forces. It doesn't really help you say, what are we trying to achieve as government in terms of socioeconomic development? No? In terms of prioritization, the original proposal, again, was we should identify a limited number of industries that as a group can drive structural change. And the reason I keep saying as a group is you may have a high-tech industry that can compete internationally, but will never create jobs that you might still want to support in order to drive overall industrialization. But you then also need to have industries that can create jobs, even if they're not high-tech. And how do we think about the collective impact is important. So the aim was to say, if we prioritize a few industries, we can get to scaled up resources, we can improve alignment across the state, so we can go to ESCOM and say, you need to treat this industry differently or whatever. And we can manage lobbying, because every industry that's in crisis, the companies come and say, we want a master plan. And could we go back one, please? And the problem is that some of them are very small and will never have a big impact, and we don't necessarily want to vastly scale up resources to them. No. The initial list they came up with had 13 industries and sectors, so really it already covered most of the economy. So it's not clear how much prioritization was going on. Of those, 6 master plans have been finalized and published. 4 have been published, but they're not on the list, and 3 of those are very small. So poultry, furniture, and sugar are very small relative to the economy as a whole. It's a little bit hard to see them having a transformational impact in the foreseeable future. And there are 5 master plans underway that are not on the list, and they're all small except for construction. Yeah? And what you can see from the graph is this, that of the master plans that were published in the middle of the year when we wrote this, they accounted for 7% of GDP, well, just over, yeah, and about 8% of investment. They were relatively labor intensive, but most of half of the employment was in agriculture. And in fact, agriculture is by far the biggest component of this group. But what you do have is they are all major export industries taken together. Well, they're not all, sorry. It includes some major export industries that account for 30% of exports, around the same share of imports. The exports are all commodity based, except for auto, which of course reflects the export profile of South Africa as a whole. No? Next slide. So yeah, so I would argue that any policy that's going to be effective, you need to have a strategic narrative that people can actually understand. Because part of putting out a policy, as you know, is to mobilize people around it. They have to understand it in order to implement it. And that means understanding the underlying logic, not just what are the targets. So in effect, we have two potentially contradictory imperatives. One is that ultimately, to grow the economy faster, we need to improve competitiveness. That is, we need to improve our ability to compete with other countries and within the country to continuously drive down costs. At the same time, we need to generate new opportunities on a mass scale. And that's, you know, as you all know, if you're raising productivity, you tend to usually lose jobs rather than create them, unless demand is actually growing. So this is a bit of a quandary there. How do we get that combination right? That's why I think you need to say group of sectors, not just one or the other. In all of the published master plans, and I think also in the engagements, correct me if I'm wrong, it's really hard to say what is your strategic narrative in the sense of saying, what are you actually trying to achieve here? What's your logic for choosing, you know, what do you think is stopping you from getting there? And therefore, what is your logic for choosing particular policy measures and interventions? In practice, what has happened was that you can see from the documentation and also talking to people, that businesses really came in saying what they really wanted. They all wanted tariff protection, except I will say in agriculture and forestry, which are export oriented. So they didn't worry about that so much. They all wanted local procurement, and they all wanted better government services, understandably, with Eskom melting down and all of that stuff. What they didn't really want to do was to fight with their suppliers about who should get the rents on our raw materials. And that came up time and again. So like, you know, feed is the main price in poultry. There's nothing in there about how are we actually going to hold down the price of feed. So there was an agreement to increase local offtake of feed, but there was no agreement to say, can we delink the price of maize and soy, which is what goes into poultry feed, in order to have lower prices for local producers, because that's our competitive advantage, is cheap inputs. The same thing for iron and ore for steel. Yeah? So I just did a project on steel, and it's clear that's a core problem at the Newcastle plant, is that there's, you know, when the iron ore and coal prices went up internationally, so did their prices. And although they refer in the master plan to the need to look at that, that's not really been a priority clearly for business. And similarly for textiles relative to clothing. They're also not that interesting in doing disruptive technological change, like coming up with new technologies, because guess what? It's very divisive and it's expensive. And for a lot of established businesses, you know, to become more competitive internationally, poultry would have to change the size of the chickens they produce. And that affects the feed they use. It affects the size of the cages. It probably affects the abattoirs. Yeah? And that's very disruptive. So, you know, much easier to say, give us a tariff than to do that, right? And government wasn't really clear also. So part of the problem was government would have to have a clarity about what they wanted. But in practice, what it looks like is government focused on saying, we want greater Black ownership. And we want clear targets where we can say, this is what we're going to gain out of this. We're going to have this much growth, this much employment. Although they didn't really give you the counterfactual, what would have happened without these interventions. Yeah? So they tended to have output targets and outcome targets, but they weren't really clear how they arrived at them or how they were justified or how they would change the overall impacts on society. In terms of the use of evidence, which again was one of the key points of the proposal initially, we didn't set up any new systems to commission research to get or to use evidence. So we never really said what would have to change in our behavior as government if we're going to use evidence better. We didn't really say, what do we actually want in terms of driving things like cost, what are the cost drivers? How do we think about inclusion? How do we measure impacts in those regards? And there was very little evidence provided on government proposals, like how did government arrive at its proposals? Or when stakeholders made claims, how could we as government evaluate them? But there was a big range. So the auto master plan is really just a research project by an expert that says these are the key economic imperatives if you want to get to 1 million cars produced, right? There was actually very little engagement on the detail. When they engaged on the detail through the APDP, they didn't implement what the clear policy requirements to implement the master plan were rejected as too disruptive. In steel, on the other end, there's like it looks, when you read it, it looks like a bunch of claims by the different stakeholders that were kind of brainstormed. They did call it V0, but I don't think they've come up with another version. So it's kind of internally contradictory, and it's really hard to say what are the priorities, because it looks like a bunch of good ideas, né? That are not necessarily saying this is what then the next steps will be. You want to hit enter, please? Yeah. If you look at the stakeholders, and this was in the original, I think it was assumed the main stakeholders would be formal business and organized labor, where it exists, which it doesn't exist very strongly in some of these industries. That means a whole lot of people were not in the room, namely low-income consumers, most small businesses who are not organized, people who are jobless, and municipalities who were often required to do a lot of the implementation. And by the way, the SOCs were not there either. And kind of the assumption was that the lead departments and the national departments would represent these interests because we are a democracy. These are important constituencies. In practice, though, there was actually, they didn't really say, can we look at the impact systematically of these agreements on these groups that were not in the room? So specifically tariffs. And I'll come to some of the outcomes as a result, but also local procurement. Local procurement may affect the cost of government services, and therefore the extent and quality of delivery. But we never really said, have we actually looked at the price differential? If we looked at the quality differential on inputs, would it actually make a difference or not? Yeah. And none of them actually say, how can we open new opportunities on a really big scale outside of forestry, particularly for small business? And the thing that I actually found most surprising was, for instance, you have in the agricultural master plan an agreement that the only kind of land reform will be based on state land and voluntary donations from the private sector. Now, you might have thought that was the kind of thing you would want to go through Parliament. But what it does mean is, of course, it's never going to get through politically, that thing, as a commitment, but it's there in the master plan. So how do we think about that? Can you want to hit enter? Yeah. If we think about alignment across the state, and this was kind of critical, Rudy, in your own presentations, was that industrial policy cannot just be a project for the DTIC. It needs to be a project for the state as a whole, because structural change is hard and disruptive, and you really need to align all your resources around it. But, the master plan projects didn't really they set up platforms to engage with business and labor, but they didn't really set up platforms to engage within government in new ways to achieve that alignment. And they didn't also have things like that, as well as platforms, things like dispute settlement. As you know, departments can deadlock for decades on end, and then nothing happens. Or you get these kind of marginal changes nobody really wants. And there wasn't anything to say, well, but that kind of engagement and alignment requires capacity. You need to spend a lot of time sitting in rooms with people. Do we have the capacity, for instance, at ESCOM, to engage with DTIC on industrial policy? Yeah. So basically what happened is, just as before, if the master plan agreed that something should happen, then, somebody at DTIC would pick up the phone and try and call ESCOM or whoever, which is exactly what they would have done before the master plan. So it's not clear how that changed. And specifically, there wasn't a link to government expenditure or a better link to the state-owned companies' strategies on how they would treat different industries and companies. So there was no increase in resources in particular, although they all said they would try and improve infrastructure, but they didn't set up any way to do that that was different. So if the thing was supposed to be modeled on auto, you know, Treasury estimates, and they're probably exaggerating, but their estimate is that we spend 30 billion a year on the auto industry. The average amount of funding for the other master plan industries was about $500 million. So we never really got that upscaling that was kind of assumed to be a critical part of achieving structural change. Next slide. Okay, so some of the outcomes, just to be clear, it's very hard to evaluate the impacts of anything in the last 5 years because after COVID, the whole economy went mad. You also have Ukraine and all of these supply chain disruptions and failures in infrastructure, which are directly related to COVID closures and all of those things. But in any case, just to project forward, because the master plans affected a relatively small share of the economy, and didn't have huge multipliers. So if the master plans actually achieved their aims, their growth would actually accelerate substantially from 1.6% a year to 4.3% a year, but that would only increase national growth by 0.2%. No? Directly. I mean, there would be some multipliers, but not necessarily very high. Similarly, with employment, they would almost double employment growth to 2%, which is really just like population growth is 1.4%, so it's not huge. But national formal jobs growth would increase by only 0.1%, which means the share of the adult population with formal employment would only go up to 28.2%, which is again very low by international standards, from 27.9% by 2030. So we can't really measure the impacts, but what we can say is if you only have relatively small industries involved, then you're not going to get the kind of big structural change. We need to overcome the big deficits in employment and incomes left by apartheid. Some examples, like I said, the crises at Eskom and Transnet, we've got these industry level platforms that can't really deal with them. You know, you call up Eskom in the middle of load shedding and say, please, could you make a special dispensation for clothing and textiles? It's not going to happen. And we don't really have a way of saying, how do we deal with that? As a group, the master plan industries have seen a slower increase in imports than other industries, but the only exports that increased were the commodity exports, and that's very much directly related to very strong increase in commodity in international prices in 2022 and 2023. They've since coming down, which is a bit worrying. Some examples from industries, like I said, it was critical that the auto master plan said we need to increase local sales dramatically to get up to scale. That would require a change in the tariff incentives that are built into the APDP. They decided it was too disruptive. So it's not at all clear how we achieve those targets in the master plan. You know, they didn't come up with a substitute measure to deal with that. Chicken imports are down because we put on a 68% tariff. It's a staple food. And domestic production increased, but not as fast. And the result is prices went up by 2.6% above inflation from 2020 to 2023, and chicken consumption is down per person, which again, it is the main meat protein that the poor consume. They're like, they can't afford red meat. We had a thing, you know, it's very hard to stop sugar imports from Eswatini because they're in the customs union. So what they did was add an offtake agreement with price restraints committed by the sugar mills. The moment the agreement ended after 3 years, they put the price up according to the PPI by 23%. They say it was, I think, 16%. But since then, and the result was that, guess what? We started importing from Eswatini again. In steel, honestly, the debate about like what the AMSA is saying is if they're not going to close Newcastle, you need to close down the mini mills that use scrap. And what that again points to is this conflict between established and emerging businesses, that the mini mills are more efficient and cheaper and more mobile. But if they grow, we have overcapacity in steel and something has to give. So ArcelorMittal is saying, well, then raise the price of scrap and push the mini mills out of business. Yeah? Whether that's desirable nationally, you can decide. And you have a similar thing about the rebates for textile. We've seen progress on woven material, but there are delays on knit material. So that if we're saying clothing is the industry that's more dynamic and can grow faster, we're still not saying how do we get inputs to them that are more affordable to bring down their costs. Next slide. Okay, so we wanted to look at the impacts of these measures on different socioeconomic groups. You know, for established formal business, it is important that government works to improve their ecosystem. That they also got import protection, and they got, in some cases, some improvements in government services and increased financing, although some of the services like licensing and so on sometimes were better, faster, easier to move than others, like, again, electricity and rail. The costs were, firstly, the engagements take a lot of time. You know, you have to take your managers and put them in meetings for days on end. They are expected in most of these things to increase their support for Black-owned businesses, whether through procurement or by providing mentoring and so on. In sugar and poultry, they agreed to price restraint. Some of them agreed, like in steel, that they would set up industry institutions and they would provide some funding for it, usually through a levy on output. And in sugar and clothing and textiles, they agreed to local procurement, like the retailers agreed to procure local clothes. So there were significant, you know, there were some significant commitments made by business to support the process. The risks were essentially, I think, that the process would fail because of government being unable to deliver across the state. So if the main thing business wanted was better government services, they often didn't get them. But also because, and this is a problem, you said political economy of industrialization. If we have an industrial policy that doesn't meet the needs of key constituencies, then then it's very hard to implement. And you're always facing pushback about why are you helping these guys and not us in various forms. Yeah? And so part of the problem I would argue with this process is it didn't provide visible benefits for the majority of voters. And that's not, in a democracy, that's not necessarily a sustainable policy. You want to hit enter, please? Okay, for small and emerging benefits, you know, they got some targeted support, and if there was accelerated growth, there would definitely be benefits for small businesses, demand would increase and so on. The costs were that it's actually, as those of you who have been in NEDLAC know, small businesses say it's always harder for them to engage because they just don't have the capacity. You know, if you have one CEO running everything, to say to them, take half a day out to negotiate means a lot more than for a listed company to send a senior manager. Yeah? And the risks are that we end up with measures that favor established business. For instance, we agreed to tariffs on inputs like steel, which we just did again. But also, for instance, in the provision of infrastructure, that in effect, we're opening the door to big business to say, this is the infrastructure we need. It may come at the cost of new and emerging enterprises. Enter, please. For unemployed and people in the informal sector, again, if the master plans accelerate growth, there will be certainly some trickle down, no question. And you would have an increase in public revenues to provide additional support, social grants, and so on. The risk is that we end up catering more to big business because those are the people in the room, which means you're less likely to get the structural changes that would lead to a more inclusive economy. And in practice, you know, we really haven't brought in most of the labor-intensive industries, especially the services. We agreed to limits on land reform. And I will say the agricultural master plan was very vague, and I don't think it's been that much implemented from what we can see. No, enter. Yeah, if we look at working class consumers, the benefits are, again, you get growth, so their incomes and employment should go up to some extent, at least marginally. It is in theory possible that as we put in things like tariffs and local procurement, producers would use that opportunity to reinvest in their equipment and their technologies and become more productive. And that in turn would lead to lower prices, although you take a hit at the start from the tariff. The costs are, of course, that we have seen higher tariffs, including on some consumer staples, notably poultry and clothing. And it's not at all clear that that's actually led to a lower, you know, that we've seen those investments that would lead to lower prices down the road. And then finally, for government departments and agencies, you know, the benefits are, again, the same as everybody else. You might get some growth, you might get some increased competitiveness. You get to go to a lot of banquets, which I do think some people in, sorry, Garth, some people in DTIC seem to enjoy that. I know, not you, I'm just mentioning from experience. The plots are government needs capacity to manage the process, including managing lobbying by established businesses, which often can have a lot more resources to do lobbying than government has to evaluate their claims. And government is expected to put in resourcing for specific measures. And in that context, a big risk, and one I think has actually been, you can see it happening, is that government promises things and then cannot deliver because they haven't really thought through what they need, not just in terms of funding, but in terms of capacity, in terms of their ability to leverage other parts of the state. Next slide. Oh, sorry, here we are. Sorry, I messed up. You want to go back? So some of the proposals are, we need to set long-term targets for industrial policy so that we have real clarity across government about what are we actually trying to achieve. Is it just raising productivity, which I really think some people think? Is it just creating jobs, which other people think, but then creating jobs where and how? Is it in existing industries or in new industries? How do we think about that? And the critical issues to me would be to say, how do we step up employment and self-employment, which really, if we're serious about overcoming the deficits left by apartheid, they have to grow faster than GDP growth, which means you really have to think about labor-intensive production. And what does that actually look like? And how do we think about global competitiveness in that context? But also, we want to reduce mining dependency. We want to diversify into other kinds of production, goods and services. And then what are growth targets that are both ambitious, but also at least realistic enough that they don't just become irrelevant? So the NDP targets of 5%, we're not going to get there overnight unless world commodity prices go through the roof again. So what is a target that would actually help us measure our progress? Or we could just say accelerating progress, but at least have some way of saying, how should that feed back into our policies? And then also more rigorous selection of master plan industries so that they can achieve what we want them to achieve. Second thing is that master plans should have a serious research-based strategic narrative that identifies the key cost drivers rather than only focusing on demand. So if we want to be more competitive, we have to bring down costs. It's kind of definitional. But most of the master plans are really focused on how do we increase demand only. And like, that's not insignificant, but that can't be all you do. And then are there structural changes in the production structure, in the structure of ownership and the way we think about the production process that would increase employment? No? So you'd have both of those things there. How do we think about new kinds of production that are innovative, that are difficult, but that would lead to a qualitative step up in employment in that industry? And in some industries that may be in others and less relevant than in others. It depends on the industry. In terms of government engagement, look, we need to have, so this is something I didn't put in the slides, but all of the master plans, the oversight body is ministerial, which means the minister runs out of time very quickly. So you really need to have governance structures that have, and also CEOs, right? So just putting together those processes, Luca can talk about this better than me, but just getting people to find a date becomes difficult. But you also need to say, do we have clear national priorities in a short list that we can then get alignment around, rather than having the long list and people pick and choose? I would argue you should have to agree before you set up the master plan, you should have agreement with the relevant government departments and agencies, as opposed to saying we will do this and then you can't get them to budge. It may mean you would have to take longer and you would have to be more modest in your expectations. And then finally, we should require a formal evaluation of the impact on consumers, small businesses, and municipalities before we agree to anything as government, because that's the responsibility of the democratic state. And then finally, we need systems for industries that are not in the master plans, because otherwise they all want master plans. And we have now master plans for cannabis, medical devices, all these small Nyana products, because it's the only way people understand to get government support for a strategic approach to their production. Yeah. And I would argue in that context, it would be useful for at least to have real clarity on what do we expect of the sector desks at DTIC. Is it advocacy and unblocking for their industries? Is it monitoring, keeping an eye on what's going on in the industry? Is it policy development? And how do they engage with other people in those areas? Because right now, it's, at least to the rest of us, very unclear what the sector desks are actually expected to produce in the context of the master plans or everything else. Next slide. Last slide. Sorry, I went on so long. I can give you the 60-page paper with you. Okay, and just some broad implications for industrial policy. Firstly, industrial policy has to meet South Africa's needs. We cannot copy Asia because they had a totally different context. And it was 50 years ago. Yeah? So as somebody pointed out, China was competing with workers in the US and Europe. We're competing with China. Our wages are about the same as China's. Their wages were much lower than the US and Europe. Yeah? And we need to say, what are our long-term objectives for industrial policy so that we know when we're on track? Yeah? We need to kind of, as they say, walk on two legs. That is to say, we need to really scale up programs, create opportunities, and empower people through innovative programs around products, around ownership, around financing, around how we use intermediaries to support small list. It's always been easier we've always been a bit of a coalition government even before. We just add in everybody's issues and we end up with these long lists. And then if you're an official, you pick out the ones you like, and those are the ones you implement. You know, so we need to be really clear. If we want to have alignment across the state, we need to say, what are our priority aims? What are our priority programs? And really get those ones to have the full weight of the state behind them. Within the DTIC, if we're serious about, you know, moving towards more labor-intensive industries, industries that can change, we need to say, these are the master plan industries, and then realign the sector desks around them and the incentive programs around them, rather than saying we'll keep the same institutional structures. And guess what? You end up with master plans for the industries where you have sector desks. You know, and other important industries would just fall off the table. And then finally, we need to say, industrial policy is about structural change. We all agree about that. Changing the structure of production, changing the structure of ownership, changing your exports, all sorts of things. That is disruptive and risky. And what we've tended to do is then say, okay, we won't do it. If we're serious about structural change, we have to say, we need clearly defined risk management systems rather than just saying, let's not take the risk.
Okay, thanks very much, Neva. I think that covered a lot of ground. I did give you extra time.
Thank you.
We were able to cover that. Okay, so what we will, there's been a lot of commentary in the group chat. I think what we'll do, rather than engage just on Neva's paper, let's get Lunga to talk, and then Rudy to give his insights, and then we'll take discussion. We do have a fair amount of time available for the discussion, but also people are welcome to engage each other in the chat, because there's quite a few comments and issues that have come through. But let me call up Lunga then to present his experience.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? It's fine. Okay. So thank you very much for the opportunity from the organizers. So I think Dr. Neva has covered the most complex parts. So I'll just do the easy part in terms of the implementation as far as master plans are concerned. So my presentation is just based on the implementation as far as of the master plans with regards to project management, how we have managed the master plans in a project management fashion. Okay, so I will be sharing some insights based on that. Next slide. Yeah. So part of what I will be talking about is really the manner in which we have approached the master plans using project management methodologies. Not to worry, this is not going to be a project management lecture, so I'm not going to ask you questions about project management, but I think it's to highlight that project management has been an enabler in terms of assisting us to implement or plan and implement master plans. There have been various benefits that we got from using project management practices. I'll also be sharing some lessons learned. Lessons learned was done in a continuous process to ensure that we don't go further down the line and then we don't review what we are doing. So we always need to take a step back and really ask ourselves, are we doing the right thing? You know, because this was a unique exercise. It has never been done before. Okay, next slide. So you will appreciate that when it comes to master plans, as Dr. Niva has alluded earlier on, that we have a combination of many stakeholders, you know, people coming from government, organized labor, private sector, service providers, and many more. And one could argue that there are many stakeholders, you know, that we could include, but at times we don't have the luxury of resources and time to add more people. But I mean, if the resources allow, one would do that. So, and this is to ensure that the benefits, you know, are covered across in terms of the expectations from the stakeholders. Okay, next slide. I just want to show the life cycle in terms of how we actually do the master plan. So this is normally the life cycle of a master plan. So this is just in general, in terms of the master plan. You'll see here we're talking about 5 phases. So the first phase is just the preparation. So we're talking about deciding on the master plan. What is it that we're trying to achieve here? So we put up the governing structures, who must be involved in the master plan, what are they going to be assisting with as far as the objectives of the master plans are concerned. And then phase 2 will be about the development of the master plan. This is where we map out the as-is situation to say what problems are we trying to resolve here. So we map out the as-is situation, and also we map the to-be situation. And this is where you will see that in phase 3, we come up with priorities and then we develop the plan. So they come from those to-be situations. And then based on that, we will come up with an implementation plan. Most probably there will be schedules around it and then expectations from the various stakeholders. And then finally, is the monitoring and controlling. So we monitor and control the activities as per plan. So you will appreciate that there won't be effective monitoring and controlling if there isn't a plan in the first place. So it is important that we have an effective plan, a plan that is agreed by all the stakeholders, and then we hold each other accountable based on those plans. Okay, next slide. So there is a need for a project management approach as far as master plans are concerned, and one would ask why. Because we're talking about economic development, and then we're talking about policies, and at the same time, we're talking about project management. So we use project management in a number of ways, but I'll mention, you know, a few here for the sake of time. This is to ensure that we can confine the scope of work to specific deliverables. So as you will appreciate, we have different stakeholders coming from different backgrounds. They will have various aspirations in terms of what needs to be achieved. So, but we have to get to that point to say, no, this is the scope of work in terms of what we need to achieve. And we need to decide on the things that will give us the greatest benefit. Also, when we approach this from a project management perspective, it allows the teams to have, you know, a strong focus on the goals to be achieved. Because as you will know, when we have, you know, large meetings with different expectations, discussions can be all over the show. And because people are expecting certain things, but based on the goals that need to be achieved, we can confine that to say, these are the goals that need to be achieved, and we need to agree on that. Also, we can be in a position to mitigate the risk associated, you know, with the deliverables. So just because there is a plan in place, just because everyone has agreed on a plan, we must not be naive to think that everything is going to fall in place. So from time to time, we have to ask ourselves, what are the risks associated with the work that we are doing? What are the risks that we can encounter along the journey? And we must be in a position to mitigate those risks or avoid those risks, or maybe transfer them to other entities if we can. So risk management is a big part of it. Okay. Also, we can effectively manage stakeholder expectations because it's a broad group, a diverse group. So we have to see that all the needs of the stakeholders, are met. Okay. Also, what we're saying here is that project management also provides a platform, to manage conflict. Okay. So let me just explain a little bit on this, that as far as, having a diverse group, with people coming from different backgrounds, conflict is inevitable because, people are looking for various, they have various interests, and sometimes those interests might be competing against each other. So therefore, Masterplans is, the project management platform assists us to manage conflict. So conflict in a way is not always a bad thing. It's not like we get into a meeting and we fight with each other. But conflict does in a way challenge the status quo. We challenge, why are we doing things this way? What is important to the nation? What is important to the economy? And once you begin to ask those questions, there is that honesty and sincerity from the rest of the stakeholders. The opposite, though, is very true, that if people are not saying anything, and then you'll find that matters are being swept under the carpet, then in the end, we will not be achieving anything because people are silent about what needs to be done. So conflict becomes very important within this space. So we achieve that through a project management approach. So also we can manage and monitor the delivery of the benefits. As you might have seen from Dr. Niva's presentation, you will see that some of the master plans will say that this is a commitment from the stakeholders. We need to deliver a number of jobs. We need a certain amount of investment. Those are the kind of benefits that we are getting from implementing these master plans. So in as much as we are busy with the activities of the master plans, from time to time, we have to take a step back and ask ourselves, are we really achieving those benefits? In as much as we're attending meetings, we are monitoring the schedules, but at the end of the day, are the jobs being, delivered? I mean, are we making investments, etc.? So the project management approach there assists us to have that. Okay, next slide. Okay, so these are some of the master plans that TIPS has supported, the TIPS project management unit over the years. So the retail, clothing, textile, footwear and leather, sugar, the steel, forestry recently, medical technology recently, and also plastics. So the overview that I will be doing is not necessarily, one by one in terms of the various master plan, but it is in general to look at the lessons that we have learned when implementing, the various master plans. So as we said earlier on, that, I mean, when I was talking about the stakeholders, so what really worked well, and it's something that is unique in terms of implementing master plans, was the fact that the master plans provided a platform where industry players engage each other on a regular basis on matters affecting their industries. Before that, we did not have that. People were sitting in their different silos, suffering if if there was suffering, but people, when they're engaged in the master plan, they can suffer together and maybe solve the problems as a collective. So it provided that platform. Also, we had, methods for tracking progress on commitments, so various stakeholders will come up with certain commitments that they commit themselves to, and we monitor those on an ongoing basis. And it made the engagements in a way to be more objective. So it's not a grocery list of things that need to be achieved, but we are factual about what can be achieved. So there were clear plans for implementations, and these were monitored and controlled. And it made the engagements to be much more effective, because when we are holding meetings, we're talking about those commitments, we're talking about those objectives and how far we are with those. Also, leveraging on diversity, since stakeholders were coming from different backgrounds. So diversity is a big thing when it comes to master plans, because you're bringing people from different backgrounds. And that on its own is a huge advantage in implementing master plans, because you don't just want a group of people with just similar mindset, but that diversity, it does something in terms of developing the master plans in a unique way, so that we cover all bases as far as the thinking is concerned. So these were some of the challenges that we faced. So you will find that at time there will be escalation issues that were beyond the implementations team's locus of control. So you will find that when you're implementing the master plans, there are a lot of issues that are outside your control. And when you have that, it takes longer to implement some of the activities, because you heavily rely on other people or other entities to unblock those things. Also, intergovernmental engagements can be a challenge, in a sense that you will find that, interactions between, government entities might not be always smooth at times, because in as much as there are priorities, you don't want to trample on people's territories or their mandates. Okay, so you have to tread very carefully when it comes to that. And sometimes it does become a challenge. So some of the deliverables, they take time to implement due to the nature of engagements and the diversity of the stakeholders. So you will find that we do know what needs to be done and we know the priorities, but you will find that at times there might be disagreements here and there. And it actually takes longer to get things done in terms of getting a consensus or on something, or maybe we are waiting for directives from senior officials from government, and that on its own can take time. So there can be, there have been major shakeups in the past, let's say in one dominant company, So it is a risk to the master plan. So I don't want to mention names. So, but a major shakeup in one dominant company can shift the entire master plan, to a different direction, or maybe a shakeup in a particular industry. It causes us to just pause a little bit and review our actions and see what we can do going forward. So those are some of the challenges. Next slide, ma'am. So where we can improve, effective resourcing for the master plans in terms of finances and human resources. So you will find that in as much as we have brilliant people supporting the master plans, but it takes time to fund the master plan. By the time we resolve the funding, time has already been wasted already. And then you'll find that the team, has to claw back on the time that was lost. Okay. We might need to review the structures of oversight committees and working groups, because at times it can become a challenge. So from time to time, in as much as there was an agreement in terms of who needs to be on board, it needs to be reviewed on a continuous basis, because some people move to other industries, some people change careers. So you will find that even the interest is no longer there. So we need to review that on a continuous basis. Also, more effective ways for escalating and unblocking issues. As I said earlier on, I mean, that you'll find that in a lot of times the teams, they deal with issues that are beyond their control. So therefore, this escalation and unblocking of issues becomes a major feature. So without the support from government officials, you will find that we are not in a position to unblock those things. Also, a narrowed focus to resolve priority challenges in an industry. So what we mean by this is that perhaps it might be better at times to focus on specific activities that will create the biggest leverages in that particular industry. You know, more like is it called the Pareto analysis, the 80-20. I don't want to sound that I'm lecturing now, but it is something like that, the 80-20 rule. So we need to have that focus instead of coming up with a number of activities or benefits that we cannot even achieve. Next slide. Okay, I think that is, I just did the bibliography so that I don't plagiarize people's work. So I don't want to be sued. So that is my presentation, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for your time.
Thanks very much, Lunga. So that's the hands-on experience from Lunga, who heads our project management unit, and the master plans that we providing support on. So I think, I mean, it gives us a lot of good insight into some of the challenges, what works, but also the benefits of having a project management approach to supporting the implementation of the master plans. Because I think, as Lunga said, we've got these plans, work has gone in, agreements are reached, but then how do we take it to the next level so that we get the outcome that's desired? Let's hear from Rudy Dix, who's our colleague in the presidency and who's been involved in master plans from quite early on in the process, and has got some useful insights. Also, there are government structures that I think he'll talk to on how some of the unblocking takes place. Over to you, Rudy.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Niva and Lunga. Yes. I am the guilty one, right? So I must fall on my sword and say, yeah, you know, anything that's gone wrong with master plans, just blame me, because it is one of those things. No. I remember when Garth was still working for dtic, and you know, Garth and I always have heated exchanges, and we eventually land always on something. But you know, this is one of the things that the president was then the deputy president started asking questions. And his question was a question about, so why is automotive so successful and none of the other sectors? And that was a simple question. So what made us start thinking about why is automotive so successful? And Garth has done an exceptional amount of work around automotives, redesigning the incentive programs, building on localization, building on you know, a whole set of other initiatives that eventually landed the first master plan. Relatively, it wasn't called a master plan. I think they later on said it was called a master plan. It was the first master plan where it developed a significant process of stakeholders, unions, employers, government departments in a 2035 strategy. There's a couple of things. But and then of course we then needed to ask, so if that's the case, can we replicate this? You know, and of course we started doing that. Now I was listening to Niva and I saw the evaluation, and so congratulations to TIP. I think is an excellent evaluation, Niva, and the team that's done that. Of course, my final comment would be that we need to implement it, right? So we need to think about systematically how we improve the master plan process. And I think some of the recommendations that comes out of the evaluations are important for us. But a little bit of context. So I was going back when I prepared for this and I said, okay, let me go to the first slide deck. The very first slide deck version 1, right? And I recall in that conversation of that initial slide deck on putting together the master plan, the one thing that we did say was that we should have, Neva was saying about objectives. We said we should minimize objectives, because the risk that we have, of course, of having many objectives is what Garth has to sit with. He has an objective of growth, employment, GVA, growth, export, volume, value, and then you can add on gender, youth, localization for this product, localization for that product. And so you then dissipate the importance of getting a sector to grow and focus on growth, and think about the multipliers as part of a process going forward. By the way, for many of you that don't perhaps know about the automotive, there was really just one objective, if I recall. This is during Trevor's time, by the way, when he was Minister of Trade and Industry. The automotive industry came to them and lobbied them and says, well, we're joining GATS and we're joining, then it was not the WTO, if I recall. But can we ensure that the automotive sector that we built since the 50s and the 60s continue, right? Because we've already decided to liberalize a significant amount of other manufacturing, clothing and textile, they brought the brunt, white goods, yellow goods that were there for mining, many of that was just decimated. But automotive had a special arrangement. And they came there and they said, one objective, we want to increase volumes, our export volumes. And that was the objective, right? Largely speaking. There were others, but the objective was we wanted to increase the number of units that we produce annually by an X percentage. And they achieved that. And of course, as it evolved, Garth was able to eventually, in the last master plan, get a percentage of, 1% of total exports globally, right? 60% localization, double employment in the entire value chain from 110 to about 220,000. And so you were able to build on that 20 years later, right? That has an automotive industry. So as you can imagine, when we looked at other sectors, it was not that easy, right? So you have all these pluses and we need to think about it. So initially when we did do this, we were trying to say, because if you put a list in objectives, right? And I see there's no slide that says this, but we were trying to hint to politicians, let's put the objective. But once you start putting an objective, that list gets long. Let me just tell you this, because again, I go to slide deck version 1. We had 5 sectors that we said we were going to focus on. 5 for growth. We made choices. We made those trade-offs, and others were very angry with us, right? Then it increased to 7. That's a week later. A month later, it increased to 9. This is after going through a political process. After that, I gave up, right? It went to 13, and then it went to 18, and then it went to over 20, right? And the reality is that you can't develop industrial policy in that way. I mean, the point about the literature out there, and Danny has written quite a lot, and you can't. It's Stiglitz himself and some of the other papers as well. You can't do industrial policy in that way. You have to make choices and trade-off. And what the choices and trade-off means is, in a low growth, low absorptive employment environment, you have to think about sectors that can do that. And I think Neva's point is quite clear. So you need to think about the sectors that can do that. You can do all the sexy stuff, but if they're not labor absorptive, and if they don't grow generally, the economy, then I think you need to think about particular trade-offs. So it's interesting because if you follow the Stiglitz Roderick paper that short one, the paper that they did in early, they begin to talk about that. And they begin to say, well, maybe the way we think about industrial policy in the old Schumpeter classical sense is not the way we need to go about, because I think Neva's point is made here that you can't think about, the way we did it in the 60s and 70s to the Asian model and then global value chains. We have to think about it very differently. And they introduce 2 dynamics, which I want to talk about, because I think it's a real opportunity. They talk about climate and how do we utilize that sector, and non-tradable services. But they say non-tradable services has its limitations. But where we're able to use, as you say, non-tradable services to a point where we can get maximum employment, I think it gives us an opportunity to build absorptive capacity, both for growth and labor in other sectors. So we need to think about that, because as we grow different sectors is quite important. So you had those problems of developing master plans, and you had to make trade-offs. And now we sit with a whole set of other master plans, which, sorry to say, I know people are going to be angry. We have to still make those trade-offs of what we do focus on and what isn't. And I'm saying the criteria. So those are interesting dynamics. And so we landed on this. And then, of course, me being not saying no to everything, I can't say no, coordinating and setting up the process around master plans, learning, and then having, all these difficult things, to a point where my friends here who joined at the hip on hemp and cannabis, I'm now chairing the master plan process for hemp and cannabis. And every night when I get an SMS or a message from him, I think, how did I land myself in this job? Right? But it's a useful one because I avoided chairing any of the others. And I thought, let me do this one, right? Because it's a nascent sector. It's new. There's a significant amount of opportunity for small-scale agricultural production, significant opportunities in the Porter's region. Let's see if we can build on that. So I don't agree with Ndiva's point of small. I think it is a significant sector for agriculture. And we can develop that into an agro-processing, aggregation models, and a lot of the work that we've been thinking about that has significant multiplier effects if we do sort that demand and the regulation path. So that's my first point. The second point that I wanted to make, and I'm sorry, you're going to tell me 5 minutes and I'll stop, right? The second point that I want to make is that many of you know that we're involved in the structural reform program, Operation Vulindlela, right? And much of what we talked about earlier that Niva says, you need to deal with constraints in the entirety if you want to have a demand-led kind of industrial policy. So the structural reform program is something that I know many of you have written about it. Garth has done this thing also, Niva too, is that we've never been able to fundamentally address the constraints in the network sector. That is logistics, energy, of course, water, for instance, ICT, telecommunications, and visa. So, of course, the structural reform program has focused on that. Luckily, we were able to decide on that, and we said to the president, look, don't add on more things here. And of course, as you know, we went to cabinet and there was 20 other things we must focus on. And we just said, no, we're not doing it. So we had that kind of power. And the argument was quite simply, these are the biggest, at least let's focus on energy and logistics. These are the biggest constraint for growth in any way. If you don't have energy, if you don't have the market reform that you needed to do for both of them, you just don't have growth. You can't get your goods to market, or you can't have energy for anybody if that's the case. So it started introducing this thing of some people were smiling and say, yeah, we told you we needed to deal with supply constraints. This is classic debate, right? Where they put supply and demand against each other and say, well, I wouldn't even bother reading that IMF paper that they published last year, where they're basically saying, what is such a silly title? The word that we don't say, something like that, right? I'll get the authors, and if you want to read it. But it basically says failed industrial policy, and it says that it's a supply constraint that we need to look at. We don't need demand-driven industrial policy. Deal with the constraints. And generally speaking, in our situation, ours is quite longer, but it's the issue around, human capability, technology-based IA, and a lot of other things, and the green economy stuff that we need to deal with. But I want to just say to many colleagues who think that our economic policy is simply the structural reform policy, that you're wrong. It's not going to work like that. The structural reform program is a component of why we need to open up the market space. And I'll explain to you why I think the master plan process from a demand path is going to be quite critical. So for those who think that our entire economic policy is dealing with supply constraints, forget about it. We require demand-led intervention through an industrial policy driven by a reworked master plan. I'm sorry, we're going to have trade-offs. We're going to have to do that, right? So I think it's quite critical because that's what you require. You require not one over the other. You require to deal with it in the way that our economy has unfortunately, bungled into a situation where we're in a low growth, low employment absorption economy. So we're going to have to deal with that. And some of the supply constraints on the OVE is quite interesting. We've done a lot of models, and I just want to reflect on some of it, if that's okay. So is that we basically said if we deal with some of the energy stuff, and here it's about, if we talk about energy, it's immediate demand of electricity supply, but also the market reforms that we spoke about in the 1998 white paper. That is opening up generation competition, separating national transmission company, ensuring that we set up an institution that is able to allow for competition in the generation space. So it's all like, these guys are privatizing. No, we're not. We're simply just putting the backbone of the grid into state hands, and we allow for private competition. Very interesting dynamics in the last 2 years. I didn't think it would happen even in my lifetime, right? Because others were saying the same thing in 1998. We didn't think this would happen in their lifetime, right? Some with tears in their eyes who developed the white paper and said, oh, we can't believe it. But we'll show you some of that. Same with logistics. It's about efficiency, improving port and rail, and about competition in that space. So we bring down costs, we improve efficiency, and we get things to market, right? Because again, natural monopoly in rail, for example, the last time we had a competition in the rail space was before Transnet became a wholly state-owned, right? And this was in the 70s because they had lobbied the apartheid government and said, look, we've got the sanctions thing, we're going to go to deal with this. We've got to protect Transnet and build Transnet into what it was today. Of course, we took that and said, well, we need to think about it differently. So my point of emphasis is that structural reform programs are going to be quite critical. And it's about creating efficiency, improving operational efficiency in the short run, in the long run, and improving competition. So when you see those reforms that are so fundamental, this is what we're trying to do. But it cannot be done on its own. It requires a demand-led intervention, and industrial policy is at the center of that. And we have different tools to be able to ensure that happens. So that's the one point that I want to make, and I think it comes through in some of it. On the sectors. So what does the reform program create, right? It creates an opportunity for us to build on the master plans, right? So I'm just going to use two sectors because this is the potential for growth. I'm going to use energy, and we can use energy interchangeably with our shift to renewables, right? I mean, with the transmission company being set up, it has an objective to, so let's start first with what we did around the reform. We changed Schedule 2. Of course, that's in the Electricity Regulatory Act. We changed Schedule 2 and we removed that cap that basically allowed for private generation to be done, right? And it meant that, if the cap was removed, you didn't have to license your plant. So that's significant, license versus regulation. It means you simply had to apply for regulation and you tick the box. So that's quite significant because the cost of doing licensing versus registration is quite significant. We took that away. In actual fact, we did that. You remember we raised the cap to 100, and then in December 22, we removed it completely. So we kind of like said, okay, so, I asked the team, so, hey, 6 months later, where is the investment? And of course, there was a whole set of other issues that we needed to do with red tape and things like that. But today, colleagues, let me use transmission. So the transmission development plan states we need to build 14,500 kilometers of transmission, given our shift in the way we're going to generate electricity. It requires for us to do a whole set of things, tariff unbundling. We need to do the tariff block for transmission. We require wheeling arrangements and a whole set of other technical stuff. But because 13 of our coal-powered 5 stations in one province, you have to literally swap the grid around, right? So where's our biggest PV and wind resource? Cape, Northern Cape, and some other places. So you need to rebuild your transmission network. Different ways of doing it, but I think we're still going to do the kind of big lumpy kinds of investments. I know many are pushing for decentralized grids, and potentially to be able to reduce the cost in far or flung rural areas, you're going to think about decentralizers, and we're going to do that. But what does 14,000 kilometers of transmission cable buy us? Right? It buys us 320 billion rand of steel. That's what it is. Pylons and cables with a whole set of the additional stuff that are there. So you can see in the way that we think about energy and energy transformation that is quite significant. Now we track a pipeline of about 130. If we think about energy and the reform, and many of the marketplace are beginning to think about it, they have long-term plans, right? Because these are not investments that happen today and then they kind of like end in 10 years' time. We know, for example, that in the marketplace, there are potentially over 70 gigawatts of renewable energy projects that are going to come online between now and 2035. Now, my point about that, and let me use another example. So we did the same thing for logistics. We separated into operations and infrastructure. For freight logistics and for ports, we've got a backlog of over 100 billion rand, right? So, think about it. Rolling stock, actually building the lines, right? We have to replace lines, for example, on the session line, rather than do this work. We have to deal with a whole set of others on the corridors that are there. Significant cable and copper theft that we need to deal with also. Signaling systems. Manual authorizations, by the way, if you see crashes on the freight logistics roadmap, you must know it was manual authorizations. And let me explain to you what it means. Because it costs quite a lot, 15 billion rand to buy a system. The train driver stops, we're supposed to stop, but the signal doesn't work, right? The robot signal. He then says, can I pass? And then the operator on the other side says, no, you can't pass, there's another train coming on this side, right? Now you can imagine the disaster. By the way, the one that happened early this year that saw the crash was at the time of the shift change of the operator doing the signal, there was a shift change, and the person that came on that minute said, go ahead, and boom, of course they crashed. So manual authorizations and investments in signal that runs into billions of rand is quite. So we then also have the open access that we've introduced, right? So we've introduced a network statement first time. The network statement is basically saying this is the state of our freight rail system. We've got 21,000 kilometers of total lines. We actually only use 13,000 of them, but we want to have third-party access of private train operating companies on about 13,000 of them, right? Now, Transnet focuses on its core corridors. What are those core corridors? We all know that Transnet is profitable when the iron ore runs efficiently and when coal runs efficiently. But there are many other branch lines, lines that are not run efficiently, for example. Those that run on the general freight palletized, agricultural bulk, automotive, for instance. So private sector can play that role. The reason why I'm going around this long story, I'm going to finish the others quite quickly. The reason why I'm going along this long story is because for the first time in a long time, we have a demand path. A lot of it is in the steel and the value chains around there. We have to use that because in any operation, in any private operation, what do you want? You want to reduce the cost. You don't want to risk by having significant amount of exports. So your supply chain and your lines of supply has to be short. And of course, we can introduce a whole set of incentives or programs to be able to do that. Now think about a 10-year demand path for steel, right? Which is people have been saying, you can't come to us and say, I need that piece and it's only for, I just think that again, based on energy and transport, for instance, I'm not even talked about services. I'm not going to chat about that because non-tradable is small. We probably will create about 2 million additional jobs. That's it, right? Even less, right? But if we're able to do that, you have a clear demand path, at least in the steel sector and all its related support components that are there. And that requires for us to think very differently to the reform program. So interlink your demand work with the reform program. And I don't think that's done. And so we're trying to fix that going forward. So I'm just making that point, and I think that's a useful thing about us going forward. And then quite interesting, I thought this I'm coming back to the Stiglitz Roderick paper. Neva, I don't know if you read it, but I thought the paper was written for us in South Africa, for those who read it, right? I read it and I think, okay, they don't mention South Africa in any of the examples, but if I read it, it's actually written for us. Because in the last part of the paper, it's called a new growth paradigm for developing countries, right? For those who want it, January 2024, and it's written by Stiglitz and Roderick. They talk about 5 elements, which is covered in the master plan, interestingly. They talk about embedded nature of developing an industrial policy. And the embedded nature is simply talking about those that are embedded in the sector, building a relationship with the suppliers, with those businesses and those who are important. So they say that's an important part of industrial policy. You can't miss that. You can't be developing something there in office and hoping for the sector in the private sector or the unions to agree to it. So they talk about that embedded nature, which is what we do in the master plan. It's a consultative thing. That's why I think it's written for us. The second point they talk about is coordination. And they actually refer to escalation. So if the minister doesn't do that, bump it up to the presidency. And I thought, you know what, Jesus, So coordination is quite critical that they talk about this, right? And the interlinkages between some of the master plans because some of them are down in the value chain. Monitoring, they talk about, and I think Neva's point in the paper is quite important, that we need to monitor the impacts and then make adjust changes. because that iteration is going to be quite important. We tend to be, I mean, some of us, right, just get stuck in the same thing. We tend to hope to achieve something and hope for different results when it just won't work. So you need to think about the ability to be able to test, right, and run that and have an adaptive, iterative process in the master plan. As government officials, as government, we sometimes rub that off onto the private sector, and they also become like that. You know, the fourth area they talk about is conditionality, right? And conditionality is quite interesting because it talks about the supporting mechanisms to be able to ensure that it's successful. But in the conditionality part that Stiglitz and Roderick speaks about is about the ability to take pragmatic risk and test. So you use an example in China where they just basically said, we're going to do this part in a province. And if it fails, it fails. We don't do it. If it works, we replicate. And I think sometimes we think too much of the bigger picture, we lose sight. What is it? The woods from the trees, right?
Yes.
Yeah, if I'm right. And I think sometimes that is what we don't do, and even talks about the ability to be able to innovate and experiment. So I like the hemp and cannabis guys, although they give me a bloody headache every single day. We're going to we've got this thing where we talk about sandboxing, right? And this ability of testing something before it is actually passed and set. And so we want to test this, right? And so sandboxing or innovation and testing it in certain markets probably is something that we do less of. We stick to our positions and we never do. And then the last part of it, and I'm coming to a close, is institutional development. So we need to build this as a mechanism in institutions. It's not an ad hoc thing. It requires, like automotive, constant working on an adaptation. I mean, the next frontier, of course, is if we don't deal with CBAM and we don't reduce our carbon emissions, you must forget about the EU market in 2035, right? We export about 550,000 units, right? The biggest market is the EU. If we're not able to, show that we are going to reduce that, then you're in trouble. Now, of course, there's also, I'm not going to get into the debate about whether we argue that we can produce for exports. The point about it is that you can't only produce for exports, and that's the literature. You have to be able to produce for the domestic market, but your ability to get out of a low growth and absorptive, labor absorptive is the export market. So I like that idea. Sorry, so. Yeah, your trouble is asking me to speak, right? And I think that the work that has been done by TIPS is useful in being able to learn the lessons and to implement that. My last point is that I think we are thinking about reworking the management of the master plan process, particularly significant support from the presidency in being able to do that, right? It is a risk because sometimes many of the departments think that presidency will implement. We don't do that, and I always say this to the colleagues. But the reality is that we have to work with departments and coordinate, and the ability to escalate is something that I think we do pretty well in trying to resolve some of it. So we need to ingrain the recommendations that are coming out of the review, out of this evaluation, and put it into into implementation as quick as possible. And as soon as we've done all our restructuring in government and our GNU and all these things, I think we're ready. A lot of those work has been done. We simply have to get it passed and then of course get it implemented. Sorry for that long input, Saul, but I thought it would be helpful.
No, it's very helpful, and I would have allowed you to talk longer, but we've got questions online, we've got questions in the room, so I think everyone's also interested in adding their views. We've had a lot of commentary in the group chat, and I'll get to some of those things, but let me first see if there are any questions in the room. So we'll take 2 or 3 questions in the room, and then I'll go to some of the commentary online, and then we'll take questions online. If you can introduce yourself, yeah.
I'm Steve Jardine. I come from the organization called RSA Clusters, and we are basically doing much like what you're doing. And our thinking is in the space from an industrial private sector point of view. So in actual fact, I find it very interesting. I think a lot of what you've been talking about, and I've been saying to my friends, I don't actually want anyone else to come into buy and Gauteng and disrupt it, because the thinking you guys have got at the moment is pretty good. And the mention was of Porter earlier, and I think that certainly from what I've been working with and what we're seeing is that we need to enable industry better. So to enable industry better, we've got to actually work out how we can do change management. We can do the project management, but change management is the big issue. So the incentives for everybody to move from where they are is going to be a huge push. Secondly is I think that we need to account for the fact is that we're going to see a lot of downstream innovation, not upstream. So when we put in tariffs, what happens is that you push up costs and then everybody in the local industries fail. The problem that you've got is Treasury doesn't necessarily agree with this program. So you can import if you're not competitive. And a lot of industry doesn't understand that, but they get very upset about the fact is that there's always this ongoing import. We mustn't lie to them. We're importing because the imports are more competitive. And then we need to work with them to fix it.
Okay, thank you. Let's go to the person next to you. Thanks. If you can introduce yourself.
Good morning. My name is Itumeleng Makgetla. I'm a political analyst. I think there is a lot of missed opportunities with regards to the international policy space. We see that during the last election, there weren't much to say about the international relations space. And I would like to speak just briefly about the Chinese example. China, whether we like it or not, does represent a lot of opportunities that we can take advantage of. But I do not think it actually has even dawned to our minds. Everything from China has become ubiquitous to us all. I mean, sure, in our homes there are items from China, from toothpicks to the car in the garage. It's just that. But when you go to China, there is absolutely nothing about South Africa. What they know about South Africa, when you ask them on the street or in the taxi, what do you know about South Africa? Oh, Nelson Mandela and de Gaulle. You know, we have discord with the West at the moment. We're not very certain. But with China, we kind of like ingratiated ourselves with them. Why are we not becoming more aggressive in taking advantage of the time that we're living in right now?
Okay, thanks very much. There's a hand up right at the back there.
Good morning. My name is Mpoto Teller, and I'm the CEO of FSA. I just want to start by saying, I think for us, master plans are quite important. And I hear that few speakers are saying maybe at times or in future, we may need to review whether we need to bring the numbers down. To us, master plans are the only platforms that we're able to raise out our views and deal with issues. But my question is, how seriously are these master plans taken in other departments? I know a lot of you would be frustrated with, you sit in master plans, you take a decision based on the evidence or information that was thoroughly deliberated upon. Then Treasury still takes its own cue. So that's the question, are these master plans taken seriously by other departments? And we really applaud the intervention of the presidency in the master plans. Point in case, the sugar master plan, health promotion levy, called sugar tax, wreaked havoc in industries. There being an insistence from other sister departments that there's no need for socio-economic impact assessment. That is only now conducted 6 years later through the Office of the Presidency. And had it not been of the sugar master plan, we wouldn't have a platform like this. So that is the second point, that we really appreciate the intervention by the presidency, but we are worried about whether other departments really take this master plan seriously. The third point is poor or lack of intergovernmental coordination. I think that's the biggest challenge. I think I would have expected that to hear a lot about that in the session. I think that is the major stumbling block in as far as master plans are concerned. I mean, I can make one typical example. We sit in the sugar master plan, we agree on a certain position, then tomorrow Treasury announces that we increase in sugar tax. And we know the impact of sugar tax with all thousands of jobs that were lost through the process. 16,000, by the way, in the first year of implementation, and the numbers are still going up. And we're heading towards another implementation in April next year. we hope we'll be able to get better results through through master plans. And I don't think we should actually take these master plans, right? Because from industry point of view, they're quite important, because this is the only time we'll ever get an opportunity to table our studies, views, and
Okay, thank you, thanks. Okay, so yeah, we've got a couple of comments online, but also one or two hands online. Let me just take Etienne, whose hand I see. Etienne, do you want to talk? Thanks.
Thank you, Saul. Etienne Vlok from the SA Clothing and Textile Workers Union. We're involved in several master plans. I think firstly, one of the very tough things with the review that NIBID and TIPS did is that when you are trying to describe a whole lot of master plans with different levels and try and generalize, it becomes very difficult. You know, it's almost like figuring out an economic plan for both Kuruman, Johannesburg, and Ladysmith. If you're going to have to kind of generalize there, you know, in some ways it won't be applicable to those individuals at all. So I first want to acknowledge that, and I do think then it's necessary to look at the master plans themselves. And then just a couple of things on what Lunga said, which I think is crucial. The first is that he spoke about it's necessary for there to be constant engagement and joint solutions. And our experience in two master plans where we are involved in has really seen this happen. In the retail, clothing, textile, footwear, and leather master plan, we've managed to solve a decades-old problem of raw materials, kind of finding a solution that worked for the weaving mills, for the clothing manufacturers, for the retailers, and for labor. And that was, you know, would not have been possible without the master plan and the processes and social dialogue involved. The next one is in the forestry sector, where, you know, once again, a old problem of secondary plantations and leases around them. Through constant dialogue, through working together with government and business, we've been able to solve that problem. So two very useful examples of how this kind of constant engagement and solution seeking and dialogue has helped. The concern that we have as Labour is that where we're struggling to implement the master plans, it may be exactly because we're not having those constant engagement. You know, in a master plan like furniture, we're not seeing regular meetings, we're not seeing constant engagement, and we're not seeing kind of identification of problems. A little bit now, but I think that's something, Rudy, that we'll have to figure out. How do we make sure that happens? Can't just be that we make a plan and then hope somebody will implement it. And then just the last point, Saul, is that with regards to the joint voice, you know, we've got we often speak about our very noisy democracy. And so what the master plans are able to do is get us to sit together, figure out our problems, and then come up with one solution or one voice, and then communicate that to government. And the online e-commerce retailers, the Temu and Sheins is an example. We identified this problem in the master plan, came and shared that with government with one voice, and identified all the loopholes that were being used, which has allowed government to act. So I don't think we should underestimate the benefit of the master plans in taking away some of the noise and speaking to government with one voice. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Etienne. The sound wasn't brilliant on this side, but Rudy, you caught those points. Okay. There's quite a few comments in the group chat, so I'm just going to touch on some of them, and then I'm going to ask the speakers to deal with as much as they can. They've also been able to see some of the comments online, but I'll just reflect on them for those that haven't. Just the impact of COVID-19 and the fact that it looms large on the impact of industry and how that's dealt with in the master plans. The issue of agriculture and food processing, what happened to that master plan. Eskom comes up, and I think, Rudy, you've touched on that. I think it was before then. CBAB comes up, and I think, Rudy, you've already touched on that. We also have questions on the need for master plans to be inclusive, We've got lots of commentary on the cannabis master plan. I don't know, Garth, if you want to make an input. Okay, great. Thank you. So Garth is the lead on that and has joined us in the audience today. And Rudy's also, as he said, is chairing on that and maybe can touch on that a bit more. Then we've also, okay, CBAM comes up a few times. And then we've got issues on the engagement process and the competing interests in the value chain. I think Neva, some of your work has touched on it, although you didn't go into too much detail. And I think Lunga refers to some of it in a very diplomatic way, but maybe we can touch on some of the competing interests in the value chain, because they do cause some of those deadlocks that are referred to. And then, yeah, just the decarbonisation issues. I think that I mean, it's linked to net zero, but it's also linked to CBAM issues. And then there's a question on SARM. Richard, we had a seminar a few weeks ago on SARM, but you will be happy to know it was approved. And we're still waiting for the launch date, but it was signed off and approved. And then, yeah, I think the issue of decarbonisation comes through very strongly in several. Okay, I think those are some of the main issues that have come through in the chat. There are a few others. Let me hand over to speakers. Let me do it in order of speaking. Sorry, Neva. And then Rudy, you'll get the last word, because then after that we will wrap up. So yeah, looking forward to your input.
Okay, so there are many points, and none of us can respond to all of them. So I just want to respond to some of them, some of the big issues that I think arose. So one of the, let me just say something, particularly in response to, it came up with Rudy, it comes up with everybody. You know, how do we get this balance right between saying we need to talk to existing producers, but we need to ensure that in meeting their aims, we don't do it at the cost of other groups in society, including other potential emerging producers. And you know where that comes up? I mean, let's talk about the sugar tax. I could argue, if we do a SEAS, how do you take into account the lives of people that are safe because they're not eating so much sugar? You know, that's the argument for the sugar tax. How many jobs is that worth? How do we make that decision? It's hard. So I would argue that if you're going to say you need to be embedded, but you need to be, there's no point saying government should be embedded if government doesn't know what it actually wants and have a way to try and deal with these trade-offs on behalf of constituencies that are not in the room. So the one thing I would say is I don't particularly like the term embedded. It's like, if you remember, or was it limited autonomy or whatever it was with the developmental state, you know, you're embedded properly when it works. You know, you're not embedded properly when it doesn't work. I would rather say what we need is to be, we need policies that are responsive to the needs of established business within the constraints set by our overall aims, which in turn are part of democratic accountability. So what's good for the majority of voters is what we need to deliver on. In that context, we should be minimizing costs to established business and helping them out wherever we can. But don't pretend that that in itself will lead to change in the economy, unless we have a clear sense of what we want. Yeah, second thing is, in this context, I think this issue of extensive and intensive growth as a concept is something we need to think through, because the point of extensive growth is you're growing by bringing in more resources. It often means you're not raising productivity. You may be reducing productivity, but you're having more people employed. There are cases like, for instance, public services, where we do it all the time, like your thing with teacher assistants. You know, what you're doing is saying we'll have lower skilled people that we pay less, that we subsidize because those communities can't afford them, but they're creating a service that is a long-term investment in our growth. So how do we think about those kinds of issues? But also things like, you know, when we work through social intermediaries to get services into communities, and they're also employing people, they need a subsidy to be viable because many of our people can't afford those services. So all of those kinds of issues that are more innovative than just saying we need to raise productivity, and at the same time say we have some industries that are world-class, we need to protect them as well. You know, so that's what I meant by saying walking on two legs, that we need both of those. We don't necessarily quite know how to get the balance right, but that it's very risky for us to say we can just be like, you know, more equitable countries like Japan, Or Korea, like you go to Singapore and they show you around and they say how much they love industrial policy because everybody benefits from it. But if, you know, and I've literally had tour guides tell me about their industrial policy, you know, it's kind of odd when you're from here. But that's because it's a very equal society, and when they grow, the benefits really are equitably spread. Not the case here, so we need to be more careful. And then one more point just from the inputs, how to make established companies more innovative in that context. That's my point, is I think on the one hand, we need to say, what do we actually want from them? Because if you've ever been on the other side from government people tend to walk in and say, what can you give us? It's like, well, what do you actually want? You know, and if we're not clear about that, you may remember that's the job summit stuff. It's like, come to labor and say, what can you give us on infrastructure? It's like, well, it's your damn infrastructure. You tell us what you want, you know? And by the same token, we need to say to the companies, in your sector, this is how we think you can contribute to socioeconomic development. And not just Black ownership, but especially supporting new kinds of production that will generate employment, if it's possible. I don't think that, you know, they can't do that if it's going to give them heavy losses, and that's the reality. So a lot of this has to be about how do we come up with social enterprise acting as intermediaries with government programs, with things that we subsidize, because a lot of our people simply can't pay, and that means those activities will never be profitable. And that's what redistribution is also about, you know? And then finally, I do think this issue of we need a system other than master plans. If we're serious about master plans for priority industries, then we need to be clear about how we're going to have platforms to talk to other industries. Because otherwise everybody wants a master plan and you drown. No? Thanks.
Thanks. Before Lunga speaks, I've given Garth an opportunity to make a few comments. But Garth, maybe the net outcome of your comments is that we do need a separate dialogue on the cannabis master plan. So I'll pose that question to you. But
so I'm going to be very brief. I think we need to look at sunrise sectors differently to mature industrial sectors. And in the cannabis sector, which I think we should begin to call the cannabis and hemp sector, personally, although that's a big debate, there are enormous opportunities linked to the just energy transition, bioplastics, and opportunities to address the blood-curdling crisis of rural poverty all across the country. So colleagues who've asked questions, maybe so they could just be given my number. The second point I want to make is that any methodology, whether it's a master plan methodology or the old sector methodology in the DTIC, is often a blunt instrument. And I think we must be careful about using a blunt instrument so it becomes almost like a formula. This is what we've got to get done. And I've really seen that in the cannabis and hemp sector. We just, despite government, had a big French delegation inbound investment mission to South Africa. And we took them to the provinces. And one of the things they said is, don't listen to the activists. Where are the experts in the room? And in the sunrise sectors, we've got to build the experts working closely with the private sector, labor, and communities to drive these processes. I could stand here and talk for the next 2 hours, but I'm going to stop there.
thank you, Garth. And thanks for the insights. I think we do need to pick up that conversation. Lunga, an opportunity for you to talk. I think you're going to have to turn your phone off there.
So I think I just want to address the issue of the value chains with regards to the competing interests. So I think from our side, what we normally do is that usually we have several engagements with a lot of stakeholders to agree on certain outcomes. Yes, I do agree that from time to time things do not go as planned. So you'll find that sometimes you have competing interests, but what usually helps in terms of our engagements is that we always point the stakeholders towards the best interest of the master plan. What is it that we are trying to do? And a lot of times, yes, I do agree that to some it might sound as a compromise, and at times people are aggrieved. But in the end, when we see what we are trying to do and we look at the objectives, people become fine with it. And because we're always looking at the benefits achieved, the benefits and the goals that need to be served. So it works well for us. Okay, I don't know if I've answered that. Okay.
I want to just touch on the presidency coordination and the role of the presidency, because I think some people misunderstand it. So I saw in the chat group, people say, no, the presidency must take over. It can't do that. It's the reason why you have departments. I mean, it's not, you know, we have got to deal with the constraint. If there's technical capacity issues, if there's ability to coordinate this stuff, we have to deal with that. And I think the hemp and cannabis, though we're struggling, but I think we're moving in a direction, for example, where someone says we don't have the capacity or the expertise, we can support it. So the presidency will always play a coordinating function, period. It will support implementation, period. It will not do implementation. It will not take over the responsibility. Because then, you know what, someone else in another department, can we give that also to Rudy and PMO, right? They will do this, and another one. Second risk about that, so you need to think about the consequences of that. It means that people don't buy it. Suddenly becomes a presidency issue and less of the department. So they'll say, oh, well, you know, you didn't consult us, we can't take ownership of it. So think about the logic of that, colleagues, and I do express it. I don't, we're not going to form. I know I saw that Ayanda, our colleagues there on the chat group, is very active, right? They're asking for a ministry. They're asking for 2 hours to talk about forming a ministry. We're not going to do that. We need to fix it within the constraints that is here. So I think this is important for us to be able to do that. I think some of the other comments are really useful. I think the opportunity through energy and the just transition is an absolute opportunity, but we're not honing into it adequately enough. And I just think that we kind of all over this show, and we say the just energy transition, energy reforms, all of that are interrelated, but it requires for us to be laser focused and say, where can we develop our industrial capacity to support that kind of transition? Because we know we've got to move in that direction for a whole host of reasons. Sarim is really good. I think that's a really good example. I know, what's this chap that worked for you that does the climate change stuff? Galo says we mustn't do panels, right? We must still do panels, but we must diversify, right? I mean, I still think, competitively speaking, it would be important. If you have a roadmap until 2035 or 2040 for producing panels, you know, let's do that. Let's develop it. My last point, sorry. I think maybe I just didn't express it properly. We had this conversation about the trade-offs, right? And we said which sectors is which and which have master plan. I think that, as Neva says, I mean, you can do your industrial strategy master plan. Every sector should be able to develop the methodology of consultation and engagement. My point was that where the resources are going to be focused on, and the emphasis must be on that which is going to grow the economy and has the labor absorptive capacity. That's just my point. So what does it mean? It means we must direct our effort and resources to those sectors that I think are going to be able to provide that. It doesn't say that we're not going to have a master plan for sugar. You guys must continue to engage, but you don't have the labor absorptive capacity. Neither will other sectors, and I can list them. But I think it's important, and I know you don't like that, but it's the trade-off that we have to make in society sometimes around that. And so I think it's going to be quite important. Neva, I agree with your points. I was just listing how the paper was arguing for it, but in a sense, I agree with you. We need to deal with the embedded issue in the way that we've done. And I think we've done pretty well, but strong lobby groups from different business people always, right? Focusing on this and that. But thanks so much. Totally enjoyed the session. It brought me back home again.
Okay, thanks very much, Rudy. There is a comment that maybe you misquoted Gaylor, but we could pick that up. But thanks everyone for the session. I think what's important about the session is to emphasize that the master plans individually are bringing the key actors in a sector together. There's maybe room to expand that so that they're more inclusive and to address some of the key challenges. What's useful for this session is to talk about some of the challenges in the master plans themselves and how we use that project management cycle from the lessons in implementation and also from the review to try and strengthen the process so that we don't lose what's already been done and we find ways of strengthening it and, as Rudy says, reformulate it so that we can have better outcomes going forward and to support our industrial policy. Thanks very much to everyone who joined online, and thank you to everyone in the room. Those in the room, there is food at the back there, and those online, hope you have a good afternoon. Thanks everyone. Bye.